On Rebuilders today, we have a special guest. Who have we got, Mark?
We've got Robin Lim, who is from Asbury University, an Aussie, who happens to be in Melbourne at this moment. But it's been so fantastic hearing his reflections on what God did, testifying to that, but also what God is doing in the world. So it's a wonderful first-hand account that I think will leave you really hope-filled. I'm excited to share it with our audience.
Yeah, it's a great episode. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both today?
I'm good. Yeah.
Doing well. Yep. Good to be back.
Midwinter vibes.
Oh, rocking it.
Yeah.
I walked here today.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did you?
In the midwinter vibes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Congratulations.
Nearly got rained on.
Yes.
But, loved life.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had some visitors from the States last week. Shout out to those crew. But they good on them, coming out from summer in California to the depths of winter.
I know.
Here in Melbourne, which good on them.
Yes.
Yeah. But there was pastries at the end of their journey, so
Worthwhile.
Yeah.
Worthwhile.
I think people expect pastries from us now. It's the thing.
I know.
created.
Yeah. But we do have a guest here today.
Yeah,
we actually don't have pastries.
We have a guest.
We do have a guest. Robin Lim, it is wonderful to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah. Fellow Aussie.
Absolutely proud as punch.
Yeah. just on that, actually, my grandpa, he was Dutch and he thought that proud as punch was proud as sponge, which just every time I hear proud as punch, I think proud as sponge.
Do Americans say proud as punch?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
How would we
go.
translate that for our international audience? You're just proud.
Just
proud.
Yeah.
Proud. Very proud.
Chuffed? Is chuffed?
I think that's more
That's not
British.
American.
That's
That's
a British.
British. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Stoked.
Stoked, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Great. Well, there we go. Language translations. Rob, it's great to have you with us. Bit of background. What do you do? What do you do with yourself? Why do we have you here on this podcast?
What do I do? I'm actually based in Kentucky, USA.
Yes.
Really. So some of your listeners may be familiar with Asbury University.
Yes, they definitely will be.
I'm a professor of business over there.
Great.
Quite a new person on faculty there, but very glad to be ministering in that context. And I also, throwing in my Australian roots, I'm a pastor in Australia too. So I carry a little bit of a co-vocational wing, I should say.
Great.
So perhaps take us on the journey from, we'll talk obviously about Asbury, but just the journey getting to Asbury.
Yes. So it is a bit of a global affair, Mark. I was born and bred in Sydney, Australia. So again, very proud of my home city and have travelled a fair bit around Australia. Went to Canberra, studied at the ANU over there.
Oh, okay, yeah.
After that, ended up working in Melbourne and the banking and financial services industry. That took me to various places in the world. And one particular area that I did end up in was in South Africa. Whilst I was in Durban there, in fact, in the hotel lobby, I came across the past president of Asbury Seminary. This was back in 2012, I believe. Ever since I met that gentleman, the Lord really imprinted Asbury on my heart. And in 2018, I guess I had the courage or foolishness, depends which end of the coin you want to look at, to head over there to follow this conviction. I commenced at the seminary over there. So there's two institutions in Wilmore, Kentucky, Asbury Seminary and Asbury University. I attended the seminary and completed some studies there at the end of last year. It took me 4 years to finish. And as I noted to Libby earlier, I commenced at Asbury University at the beginning of this year, 2023.
And you mentioned that you're a pastor here in Australia. Just tell us about how that came about too.
Yeah, I've been heavily involved in more an ethnic Australian denomination here.
Yep.
And I've got a huge heart for the second generation. So at the time of when I had to pick between which denomination I wanted to affiliate myself with, this was back in the States, it was quite obvious to me that I wanted to remain rooted with my home country and the, as we all know here in Australia, the huge multicultural well that is in Australia.
Yeah, definitely.
The opportunities that come out of that, both missionally and evangelistically. So I'm based with them. I usually come back around 3 months a year to saturate myself in ministry in that sense. And I'm thankful that I get to also then head back to the States for the rest of the year to teach business and finance with a theological lens.
Yeah. I think that's probably something to even note for our listeners, that I don't think a lot of people overseas who have not been to Australia don't realise how multicultural Australia is. And I saw a stat the other day because, you know, I've been to the UK a lot. Australia has twice as many people from a migrant background as the UK, which is an interesting statistic. Yeah. So you are studying at the seminary, but then you make a sort of transition horizontally across. Tell us about that.
Yes, it came out of the blue, and just like to testify to all of us, even again to myself, God really does like to outwit us sometimes. And we may have plans and they get derailed in a good way, even beyond our understanding. I was planning to complete and then jump onto the trajectory that I already had in my mind to minister in Australia and whatnot. However, I was asked by the university, they found out about my financial and banking services background and my desire to see faith in the marketplace, public theology, and just the convictions they held as an institution and where my heart is. There was a good match, and I felt the Lord really leading me down that path for this season. And in a very personal way, and I would know we'll get to the Asbury outpouring later, but I really felt a sense of personal confirmation on my side after that occurred. But you all should visit Wilmore, Kentucky at some date.
Well, we could have a deal with Rebuilders listeners. So, from my understanding, you are lecturing business and financial with your financial background, and you're doing that for only a handful of weeks when something quite sort of earth-shattering happens. I would love you to share that with the audience.
Yes, talk about timing. I actually only commenced in that role in the first week of January.
Yeah, wow.
And I remember going around to the various faculty members and staff members just to get an idea of what God was doing on campus and hearing stories about people praying, hearing about the climate of spirituality in the dorms. But lo and behold, as we all know now, on February the 8th, so just a few weeks after what we now know as the Asbury outpouring occurred. So I feel tremendously blessed to have been there and to have witnessed what I believe is something which is not simply held within Asbury University itself, but something which I truly believe is manifesting in many, many other parts of the world. In fact, I really think what we have witnessed in Asbury University it has occurred in other places, but we may not have heard or witnessed it. But there's something so obviously unique about it occurring in America, and we all know about the challenges Christianity faces in the Western world, and for it to occur there, I think it just provides a renewed hope to the global church, capital C church.
Yeah. I'm just fascinated by something you said there too. Like before we even get to the outpouring, when you did that little reconnaissance of just testing or asking about the spiritual climate before, what were people saying?
I think there were two streams of thought. Just to paint context of the area, Wilmore, Kentucky has experienced outpourings, revivals in the past. There was a very well documented revival that occurred in 1970 and people associate it very closely with the move of God that occurred during that time, not only in the USA but across the world. So there is that heritage, and because you have people that are still alive today that have experienced it, there is you have the gift of testimony, which still lives, and people sharing stories. And gosh, can I say that when you talk to some of the older generation that have experienced not one but now two revivals, it is so touching to the soul to see how much an individual's life can be impacted that way. In fact, sometimes when you speak to them, they still get quite emotional, just harking back to the memories and the change in heart that they had. But there is that heritage there, so you have that aspect to that stream. On the other end, Asbury, or Wilmore, I should say, is a fairly transient town, as you'd expect from one that has two academic institutions.
Yes.
So you have people coming in that don't have that heritage, students especially. But the ones that do hear the story, they contend. You do get a sense that it feels like a responsibility to contend. It's part of the heritage. But there are also a number of people that will not be as heavily involved or aware of this heritage. And so I think you do have these two streams at play, and that's very much what I felt when I commenced at Asbury University at the start of the year. Some contending, but there was also a sense of, I guess you can even state the word apathy. So two streams, and obviously it's shifted dramatically now after the outpouring. But no doubt, even when I reflect back on that now, that is also something that we see in many communities, isn't it? You see those two streams.
Yeah, I was just about to make that comment, actually. I feel like that very much typifies a lot of what we've talked about over the last couple of years, this a burden and a hunger for renewal, but also like this general kind of malaise and apathy around, communities of faith. And God's obviously doing something in that. Last week's episode, we talked again about the contours of renewal. We've talked about Asbury, the Asbury outpouring on this podcast, but you were there. We would love to hear your experience. I mean, we were blessed as a church to hear your reflections a few weeks ago. I personally was deeply moved by them. I've already prepared myself with some tissues here beside me. But so encouraging to hear testimony of what God is doing.
And as an opening line to us here, but also to everyone listening, I want to really state strongly and with joy that Aslan is on the move, to borrow that term from C.S. Lewis. Again, I have to continually state this. Asbury University is not the only place where an outpouring has occurred, and we need to also view Asbury University in context of everything else. It is but one manifestation of what God has done, and even right now in Asbury and during the outpouring, we will continually asking, Lord, make this a come and see movement, but absolutely a go and tell movement. Please don't contain it. Actually do things larger in other parts of the world, that even the name of Asbury may be diminished. But where was I on that day? It was February 8th on a Wednesday. Being a Christian liberal arts university, we do have compulsory chapel for our student body. And that morning at chapel, it went along as normal. There were a few things to note, though. It was unique in that there was a gospel choir that day.
Okay.
And we very much wanted to not only recognize that, because I believe there's something there with the multi-diversity of the campus, but also I think it symbolizes something which is going on more broadly around the world. Secondly, there was no hype in that room. My friend was preaching, and admittedly to him, it wasn't a amazing preach, and the service ended on time. People went back to class. But the extraordinary piece was a few students remained back to linger. And in the midst of that lingering, the Lord birthed something. There was no leaders. I must stress there was no charismatic personalities. There was no technical support. There was simply a small group of students that chose to linger. And news of this student group, small student group, had spread across campus. Again, nothing extraordinary, but obviously something which brought smiles to people on campus that were involved in the spiritual life of it. However, from that, we saw a magnetism, I think, that drew people to it because there was an authenticity that was there that you do not see or witness too much today, whether it's in our apparent spiritual spheres or secular spheres. I went to teach class at 1 p.m. that afternoon, and I recall 4 students barging in at 1:30 p.m. Without any notice, and they looked like they had been swept up in emotion. And one of them, who I knew quite well, blurted out, "Prof. Rob, you need to go to Hughes Auditorium now. Revival is breaking." Obviously, when you hear a comment like that, you don't. Well, first of all, you don't expect comments like that. But I must confess, there was a level of skepticism that came into my mind. And I was hesitant. However, enough of me was curious to stop class that day and to encourage my students to head off to Hughes Auditorium. And can I testify, even before I got inside that chapel, there was such a strong, thick presence that was reverberating from it simply through the cries of the young adults in that room. There was a purity which was so rare today, as if every single word that they uttered was meant to be heard by the Lord. It wasn't sung for the sake of lyrics and because the tune was nice and it was the latest Christian song of the day, but there was a deep, profound sense of declaration through it. And I remember when I got into there, I was struck by the simplicity of it all. There was, again, no hyped up instruments. There was simply an acoustic guitar at that time, no projectors, no lyrics, yet people were still singing in one accord. And in the midst of that, you could also hear students repenting and confessing to one another. And even beyond that, you could hear students weeping as they were at the prayer altar. And you could tell that this was not manufactured because everyone in that room was in a posture of vulnerability. There was an openness to one another, which was high risk in the eyes of obviously humans and how we conduct ourselves with one another. But because the veil, the veil to their soul was so open, it felt like they had this direct intimacy with the Lord. That student body group that was in Hughes Auditorium just continued to grow after that. Again, not because there was anything worldly attractive about it, but the presence in that room, gosh, even when I think back on it now, it was so tangible. It was so peaceful, so joyful, so holy, so it just sung into your soul. It gave vitality to your faith. It made you bold and courageous, yet there was also this subtle fear of the Lord, but not in a way that made you want to shun away, but made you just want to bow down.
That fear of the Lord phrase is a really interesting one because in theology, often there is this continuum between the immanence of God and the transcendence of God. And, I think very much so you could argue that there has been a cultural drift. I think it's part of something that's been in the contemporary church. It's also in our contemporary culture towards the immanence of Jesus and how much he's like us and walking alongside of us, which is all deeply biblically true. But what I'm also hearing is it's almost like this can combine both. There was that close presence, but then there was also this fear of the Lord, this yirach, this sense. Yeah, just be fascinated with that, because I'm just wondering too, for perhaps emerging generations like Generation Z or Generation Z, that perhaps that's something newish. Would that be right? Yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I absolutely hear you. And the way I like to illustrate this fear per se is via verse, or that image of Isaiah saying, "Woe to me, for I'm a man of unclean lips."
Yeah.
So it wasn't so much not wanting to be in the presence. There was a magnetism to be in the Lord's presence. There was a beauty, there was a joy, there was a peace. Yet there was such a respect and reverence for who the Lord was, not because we couldn't approach him, but because there was a sense that, do I have anything that I can of myself to offer to the Lord in this way? So in another way of saying that is that there was this great desire for myself to be holy too, to be holy as God is holy, in a very unusual way. Because of this desire to be holy and the way that God is holy, there was a desire to see my fellow sister and brother to be holy too.
Yes.
So there was a relational aspect to it. There was a social aspect to it. And I think in some ways that's why when people came in, there was a magnetism, yes, to that presence in the room, which I believe was the Lord's presence, but also the full expression of the church there. People were just reaching out and engaging with one another without a facade, without a sense of entitlement or a social transaction to take place.
Yes.
But simply because they wanted others to experience that same intimacy that they were experiencing with the Lord. And it's so hard to use words to describe that experience in the room, because it is even beyond words. But all of that mixed together really did feel like the veil between heaven and earth was thin at that point. And it did give me great hope for the future. It affirmed my hope eschatologically, knowing that that is what a very small foretaste of what we can look forward to.
Yeah, wow.
That reverence, that love, that peace, that joy, but also that reverence for the Lord.
Yeah.
I'm just interested too in that sense of that fear of the Lord, that reverence, also from what I've heard, also led to public confession and elements which, I think, different moves of God that have happened as I've been alive. And, I think of people who've been deeply affected from things like, the early charismatic renewal and Toronto, different things like this. There was an element where often there were sort of signs and wonders attached to that, and that was sort of this move. And but it's really interesting that confession, there was something almost older, evangelical in its purest form of that word around the gospel and people confessing their sins. Yeah, just interested in that dynamic of it too.
Yeah, there was, and just noting those other revivals that occurred. I did have the privilege of meeting a theological historian who studied revivals, recent and those in the First and Second Great Awakening, just to hear his view on the characteristics of this particular move of God. And he did note some of the revivals you mentioned earlier, and the charisma involved in that. But he also noted there was a charisma here for the Asbury outpouring, notwithstanding that it felt a lot more gentle. And I truly believe when we look at the church, in the same way that we read Ephesians and we see that there's various body parts that we all play in the body, but the church also has many various traditions that form the universal church. And what God did during the outpouring is you did see this broad consensus of people. It might not have felt like or be familiar with some that have experienced other revivals in the past, but I think we saw a different type of gentle charisma that was manifest. It was marked by 4 clear themes, this heavy sense of radical humility.
Yeah.
And when I say that, it's a radical humility in the sense that people just had this gentle force to continually posture themselves lower, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. Again, that word. And in full recognition that we didn't want to celebritize or platform ourselves, but we just simply wanted to see Jesus glorified because God had distracted us in that moment. The second theme that really came out was this sense of unity. And again, going back to what you pointed out earlier, Mark, there have been other wonderful moves of God in the past. However, we did see this universality that came through in this outpouring. We didn't note it on the day, but because we were all distracted by God. But there were so many different types of Christian faith traditions there, denominations that were present and worshipping in one accord. It was absolutely beautiful. And when I reflect back on this now, I remember the Catholic priest that we saw. I remember the again, very from classical to contemporary to traditional worship styles or approaches to the church present. In addition to unity, I think I need to also express the multicultural aspect of it. There were many, many different peoples of every tribe and tongue, to borrow from Revelation 7. Another attribute that was so clear was this concept of returning to holiness. And as I described to people when I talk about Hughes Auditorium, it is a very old chapel. And right at the back of the hall above the altar, there's these words plastered there, holiness unto the Lord. And that's, for one, those words you don't really hear uttered on the streets of Australia, let alone in most countries. But that desire for holiness seemed to, what that message entailed in that banner seemed to come out and seep into people's hearts. Not a holiness that was defined by moralism, but a holiness that was, again, as I mentioned earlier, I want to be like God because God is holy, and I want to see holiness manifest in the world, in society, because it brings flourishing. And the final attribute that was so clear was this overwhelming affirmation of love. People went in there, and it was the most beautiful sight to see. And as soon as the presence of the Lord just removed those facades that we all hold on to, I hold on to, we all do, when they melted away, you were just struck with a pronounced declaration that you are a child, you are a daughter, you are a son of God. And that confirmation was just so assuring, especially in our time, in our era.
One thing I'm fascinated by, and I was thinking about this, are there, and because we're having this conversation too, and what God's been doing amongst us as well, and what we're hearing from listeners writing in, and I guess one of my questions is there this, and you may not have an answer, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but these are really interesting, these different attributes. That is there a meta move of God, and then there's local expressions of it. So it's interesting even looking at these. If we think about, I think we've been outside of America, but looking in, and I think probably the sort of very public tumult that America's gone through, particularly in the last sort of few years, some of the elements of that, there has been a lot of, both in the secular and Christian worlds, lights shone on powerful, charismatic people, and particularly when that goes bad. So in a sense, radical humility is the opposite of that, a sense of unity during a time of tremendous polarization. Even, I'm not sure if that was a subpoint of unity, but even the multicultural element during a time of real, racial tumult and Amy Chua wrote that book, Tribes, tribalization, holiness at a time of really what people have lamented, I think, sort of corruption coming in, at high levels, personal levels, and there's sort of almost that Puritan side of America in terms of moralism, turning into something almost sort of hedonism,
Yes.
And then the love again is almost an antidote to just the fractious political and social, lack of trust, stuff that's been happening. Do you see? Again, you're an Aussie, but you've been living there. That's how I sort of look at it. Sort of, I guess, looking at sort of someone who looks at culture, it's almost like these things are the opposite of what's been happening in the culture. Just fascinating if you've got any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I do think it is very countercultural, but I do think it is countercultural in different forms in different societies. And that's the beauty of these manifestations of the Lord, or even just the word altogether when we read the word. The way that it can contextualize and pierce different societies based on their specific symptoms. So if I take radical humility, for instance, and I look at the American context, everyone knows that America is the leading economy. It's a superpower. It has a large population. It has significant capitals, which are hubs or incubators for technology and whatnot for the rest of the world. So they hold that mantle. But because of that, there is a heavy temptation to platform oneself. And with great levels of status and power, obviously the temptation of pride is very apparent. So radical humility in that context is quite clear. However, I think in Australia, radical humility hits a different way.
Yes.
We have this... I think if you asked Australians generally if we feel we are humble, I think most would say we are, because we're doing it relative to our view of the great superpowers of the world.
Yes.
And we have this phrase, "she'll be right, mate," in Australia, for instance. And it's a very stoic type term. Just to illustrate what that means for people that aren't from Australia, "she'll be right, mate," means if you get injured and someone asks you how you going, and you usually respond, "I'll be right, mate." Or if something breaks and someone comes along and asks you, "Would you like me to help you with that?" We try to deflect any sense of need, and we'll say, "Oh, she'll be right, mate." And I think inherently within that there is a pride
100%.
because we don't want to keep ourselves vulnerable. So I think radical humility can teach us something there. Also in Australia, this whole concept of a tall poppy syndrome. We're so fearful of power that anyone that attains or earns anything is pulled down. But I think that is also a sense, there's a false sense of humility in that. In some sense, we're weaponizing humility, aren't we? And so I think this whole concept of radical humility, there's just two words, radical humility, but I think the ways that it can serve as an antidote to societies differs slightly.
It's interesting. I wonder even if there's something in that, because I think what we've seen in the US is a lot of those platforms pull down, and I think even our social media landscape. But I wonder if even there's something that our sin in Australia, I call it that. I love to that. It's so true. Like we're like, Australians are world class at humility. It's almost a self-deny. You didn't say that, but I was almost thinking that's almost why Australians might think we're so humble. Which, if you think of that, you're not humble. But almost it's that horizontal undercutting and tear that person down. And I wonder if that's actually catching on. Like, I think actually, there's almost this sort of like sideways tearing down of people. So almost I wonder if the tall poppy syndrome in a way is going international. It's almost the next phase of it. That's just a little aside I had. But I think you're right. I mean, I think even here in Australia, how we've seen it is less around the platform thing as much around the challenge around the life of comfort. America has, as you said, global superpower. But then also, like I saw last night, I think Adam Tooze in the Financial Times put up a thing of like America's now life expectancy has dropped below Turkey, and West Virginia's life expectancy was level with North Korea, which is staggering. Australia doesn't have that. So there's an element like, we don't see ourselves as a superpower, but actually we're an incredibly high performing middle level country who has an incredible standard of living. So I wonder for Australia, it's more the platform of my good life. And we've seen, even people coming forward and giving their life to Jesus, in these sort of different moves. That's a radical counterculturalism of, am I willing to put my high standard of living and comfort and not needing help on the altar before Jesus? So I think you're right. There's something in that where it plays out in different countries.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, I think that's absolutely right, and something that we need to recognise. If I put my Australian hat on, by upholding ourselves that way, there is a great sense of us, in some sense, wanting to prove ourselves to
100%.
be. We're trying to prove ourselves to be humble, and by proving ourselves to be humble, that actually is a manifestation of pride itself. So we're looking for, using it negatively, but pillars to demonstrate that we are humble. And manufacturing it. Even with whether it's sports or which we're well fond of here, or any part of society really.
And just to let the audience, particularly the audience in the United Kingdom, know, this cannot be used in any way as a commentary on the Ashes or anything about that. Trying to prove ourselves as working class heroes to the members of the MCC. So it's fascinating how God uses that, and it's almost in some ways too, like, the incarnation is a thing. It's almost when God's presence comes, it also incarnates into a culture in a particular way.
I'm also just interested, mentioning the idea of radical humility being something that sort of expresses itself in different ways in different cultures. I feel like that returning to holiness, as you were speaking, I had that phrase that, people use to kind of lord over one another, oh, you're being so holier than thou, that kind of notion. And I feel like that's kind of captured in what we're talking about just then with the Australian culture of cutting one another down, and the idea that holiness is something not to be sought but to be avoided, because you don't want to be higher than somebody else. But you were mentioning this idea of, it's not a moralism, but there's this holiness that we seek after because we want to see God's goodness and his love saturate society. So I'm just interested in your thoughts about how, like, the notion of holiness could change society, I suppose, and what you're sort of seeing based on the outpouring.
Absolutely. And in some sense, the way I approach that question will probably be similar to how we saw the radical humility piece manifest in different cultures. Even if I look at Return to Holiness, from my perspective, when we look at it in America, and it's well known that there's a Bible Belt there. One of the temptations that can occur there is Return to Holiness could very easily turn into a competition for moralism. Because there is a embedded cultural code there. Now, whilst I say that it is good for us to live in a moral way, yet if that is our only intent so that we can place a scout badge onto our shirt and say we've achieved something, then it kind of defeats the purpose. The funny thing is, and I'm not sure whether you agree with this, but in Australia, I feel that it's the same thing. There's this moralism piece that is there, but it's not trying to attain it. It's trying to be as far away from it as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Because there is that bigot element that could be associated with it. And it's, I think we're fascinated and we're really keen to be the good bloke, very accepting, and be nice to people. That kind of rings true down under. But if anyone wants to hold up this, the moral flag, then automatically rings alarm bells.
Totally.
I should say rightly so as well. I think there's
Yeah.
been a lot of own goals that the church has committed, and we need to repent of that in some sense, myself included. But I think that detraction from moralism in Australia is a different way of return to holiness. But the counter piece that I feel the Lord has done through Asbury University, that is counter both to that manifestation of moralism in the US versus Australia, is we see it as a standard in both sides. The US sees it as a standard to attain, maybe Australia sees it as a standard to detract from.
Yes.
But really, holiness it's not a standard, it's a person. Holiness is Jesus. And everything that we view of Jesus' ministry was not done to attain a moral standard.
Yeah.
It was done to serve, to see flourishing, to see love just overflow across everyone he came across. And I think that reconfiguration, or it's not even a reconfiguration, it's a restoration of what holiness is that was brought to life during the outpouring, is something that has taught me a deep lesson. And again, I've got no doubt that that return to holiness will manifest itself slightly differently, not only at a country context, but even at an individual context, because we all have our distortions of what that means. And just being able to be gently pushed and prodded along to what holiness is. And it is a person, it's a relationship, it's the embodiment of someone that walks beside us always to the very end of the age.
It's beautiful.
One of the things that people may not be aware as well, and I was fascinated in chatting with you, is the way that this has sort of spread out into different places. And, yes, it has been in the Bible Belt of the US, but then God's using this in really interesting ways outside. You're heading off to Asia soon. Just love to, whatever you'd like to share about that would be really interesting for our audience to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And very much in the vein of encouragement, as you noted, Mark, there were spot fires across the US. Just starting at that level, during the outpouring itself, we were absolutely in awe of the number of people that came, not only from around the US, but also the world. If I focused on the US element first, the other aspect that was unique was the Gen Z representation. And seeing them come, maybe some out of curiosity, maybe some out of genuine desire to respond in faith, irregardless. Even some skeptics maybe, and witness this move of God and then be driven and compelled to go back to their own campus to testify, and then seeing spot fires break out there. So the number of schools and universities that broke out in worship, prayer, outpouring was phenomenal. I wonder if there is actually a tally list of the number of schools and universities that experienced the presence of God in that way. One story, for instance, was we were in a prayer room underneath Hughes Auditorium, and it was a place for friends and family of the university to just uphold what was happening in Hughes Auditorium with prayer. And I remember very vividly 2 students from another university popping their heads in, thinking that it was a room for prayer over them. They came in, and there was a world-renowned theologian in the room at that time, and we told the students, look, this room, we're praying for what's happening above, and please join us. And they said, oh, we actually want prayer for ourselves. So why not? Let's pray for them. And it was amazing hearing their heart, hearing their desire for their university to also experience the move of God. And I kid you not, we prayed for them, and we are not the vehicle of this occurring. It was clearly the Lord, but we just got the joy of participating by praying over them. A few hours later, we received a picture from social media that stated that the university that these students are from, a few hours later, had broke out in prayer and worship, and students were being baptized in their fountain. And, there are countless stories like that. Just boldness coming into students as they went out and spread this across the USA, in saying that there were also numerous churches that we've heard of as people have gone to testify, those that came and those that were encouraged, and students as well that went to testify. And many of the people that we know that went out to testify at these churches, they're not the most eloquent people. They're not winsome. But I think in that sense, you can absolutely shine the light on the Lord and give him the glory for what is happening. And you saw prayer altars filled to the brim in some of these churches because of the testimony of a few. And as I noted, I keep saying this word, but hope was renewed. I think people recognized that Aslan is on the move. I'm not just living religion, I'm living a faith that is real. And God is present. And then you hear the testimonies from abroad, from Japan or from the UAE. There was a wonderful story. The final night of the outpouring, it just happened to coincide with this day called the Collegiate Day of Prayer. This was planned well in advance of any outpouring. And its purpose is to invite all college campuses on the USA to pray for awakening on their campus. But again, the Lord outwitted us. And it appeared to be a good bookend to the outpouring. It was also televised, and we heard of an English news channel in the UAE that decided to televise this. And the number of responses they got back because of this this televised event was astounding. Like I just to think that was picked up and televised into that part of the world. And then you just continue. Again, I was just talking to David Thomas, who I know Mark knows, earlier this morning, and he was testifying to just a special time in intimacy with the Lord that came about when he visited Norway. Visiting a church there, again, they were just renewed with hope that Aslan is on the move. And this church in, I can't remember the town anymore, just desiring to get on their knees and pray for awakening, for their land and outpouring. And again, that whole concept of lingering just occurred. And people wanted to remain, give space for the Lord to move, not be dictated by agendas and itineraries and foremade plans, but just to rest and trust and enjoy the presence of the Lord and to cry out to him, because he is the author of time itself.
Yeah. Well, it's there's almost an image that you inadvertently gave there of those young men coming and you guys are praying under. So I think from my recollection when we spoke that underneath Hughes Auditorium there's a secondary room that's directly underneath it, and that became a place where many of the people who'd been hoping for this, shepherding it, had been praying underneath. And I wonder whether there's almost something metaphoric in that, in the sense of, I think a lot of the people listening to this podcast have been the kinds of people who perhaps the only person in their church or the handful of people in their towns, or perhaps have gone through COVID and seen their churches diminish, but then their hope grow. That there's almost been this sort of metaphoric under the room group of people who are praying, and they haven't felt like they've seen a lot of results. But then I wonder whether, like, what God is doing, and I just wrote down that, hope is renewed, that those listening who have been submerged in the downstairs room, to have hope that the above stairs room will fill with people, and that's, to keep pressing. And I think the story of Asbury is a really encouraging one, because I think that there was seeds 1970 people praying, people shepherding. And there's also a metaphoric element in it too, a parabolic element that they weren't seen. They weren't on the platform. They were interceding in the hidden place as well. And I think we know the people who write to this, there's a lot of people and contact us who are interceding and, Norway, Finland, rural New Zealand. There's all these places, that people have said, I think today's been a fantastic encouragement to hear this testimony. And I love the language of testimony. Testimony is when God moves and God does something. Yeah. So, we're just really encouraged to, hear this story.
I'm equally encouraged by the stories I'm hearing. And in some sense, just on that point again of renewed hope, it really feels like, for myself anyway, I'm looking back and thanking God for the things that have happened in my life and on what He's done in the past and whatnot. But then because of this outpouring, it's as if now I'm looking forward and I'm looking towards hope, not just in the past that had occurred, but hope that, yes, I know that hope is going to occur in the future because it has been promised. And because of that, there's just so much vitality and life that just is given to us because we know that it's already won. The battle is already won, and that we get the privilege of participating in this. The only thing you can do in response is worship. So.
Yes, Liddy's composing herself.
I am composing myself. Thank you, Rob, for testifying. I was really struck by that word, and you just mentioned it as well, Mark. The testimony isn't just a retelling of what's happened. It's testifying of God's work and God's goodness and His grace and His mercy. May we see more of it.
Amen.
That is our prayer. So bless you, Rob. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of you, our listeners, for joining us again. We'll be back with more. Now, if you want to get sort of the inside scoop or the background conversation, we have our subscriber chats that we send out a few days after the episode. So you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co, and we'll see you next time.